Welcome back to another edition of Components Breakdown. We're going to take a more generalized look at today's featured title called Terroir, which was a 2010 Essen release game. Thematically, Terroir is a medium to heavy strategy game in which each of the 2 to 4 players takes the role of a rich family in the city of Terroir, developing and protecting the city through a number of rounds. Now, a typical game of Terroir is going to last anywhere from about 90 to 120 minutes, or an hour and a half to 2 hours. Now, each of these players does so by influencing one of 3 very specific areas on the board. The military, which is represented by the red palace, the clergy, which is represented by the white bishopric, and the civil society, which is represented by the yellow city hall. Through both taking advantage of the opportunities available in the city and dealing with the numerous challenges and events that threaten it each round, the players will try to accumulate influence and ultimately the most number of victory points to win the game. So let's go ahead and set up a game and take a look at all of the gameplay mechanics. The first thing I want to discuss was Terroir's theme, and it is undeniably and distinctly Euro in fashion in every sense of the word. And although that may be the case, it is incredibly consistent throughout all the mechanics of the game. The artwork, the components, the events, and all the activities make thematic sense and are correct and cohesive in every way. The other thing I wanted to mention are the components. And although there is nothing absolutely spectacular about any of the components in the game, they're all serviceable and again make sense thematically. What is really noticeable, though, is the game's wonderful use of a very novel, old-style artwork that is used in all the visual components of the game. Now, that's not typical of most games. Most games have a very Western or Hollywood-style version of what we believe the medieval lifestyle was like. In this case, once again, it really ties in with the mechanics and the gameplay to the theme in a very rich and artistic way. That is not only evident in all the cards, all the event cards, but as well as the game board. It's just very novel, it looks very nice, and thematically it really makes sense and it's consistent throughout the entire game. Now, when the game starts, each player is given a selection of citizens, and I've already placed a 2-player game and set up a 2-player game. And although we're not going to walk through all the mechanics in order, we're going to give you a basic idea of what Terroir is all about. Now, as I said, each player is given a selection of citizens, or meeples, that are placed in one of 3 different buildings in the game. There is the palace, which is the red, the bishopric, which is the white, and the city hall, which is yellow. Now, the number of meeples placed at the start of the game is completely dependent upon the number of players participating in the game. In a 2-player game, each player is going to start with 6 meeples or 6 citizens. As you see, blue has 3 here, 1 there, and 2 over here in the city hall. Each of these 3 areas represents one type or color of dice. Now, as you notice, each of them is color coordinated, so red, white, and yellow, and they also represent the dice that you see there in the game. All of these dice are associated with particular locations, activity cards, and events. So again, looking around the board, you see white activity cards which pertain to the bishopric, you see red activity cards which pertain to the palace, and yellow activity cards which pertain to the city hall. Now, for instance, the red dice, which are generated by citizens of the palace, are especially effective at fighting off military events that occur from turn to turn. White dice that you see above that come from the bishopric are generated by citizens there and represent the religious power in the city, of which they can be used to also build sections of the cathedral, which is in the upper right section of the board. Yellow dice, down here in the bottom right, are generated by citizens that are in the city hall and represents the city's merchants and the purchasing power of those players. And they're typically used to generate additional money for the players. Each die, or each citizen in each of these buildings, also has an upkeep cost that affects that player's income from round to round. Some of the players, or some of the buildings, cost more simply to have players or citizens in those specific areas. And it is really through this immense and very differentiating combination of variable incomes and dice powers that will ultimately ensure different strategies, numerous choices, and plans for players to not only change from round to round, but from game to game, depending upon what activity cards come up, where they choose to place their citizens. There's so many options and choices for a player to make in any given round that it really, truly makes this game special for me personally. Now, going back, let's go through just a typical round just to show everybody some basic gameplay elements. A game of Troyes is going to last a X number of rounds, again, depending upon the amount of players that participate. Please read the rulebook if you are interested in playing a 2, 3, or 4 player game. I'm simply going to start showing you some very basic 2-player options in the game. A 2-player game is only going to last 4 rounds, so it's a fairly quick game. Most of the activities take place at the same time, so all players will be partaking in each phase of the game at the exact same time. Now, going back, the rulebook calls the very first phase of the game actually Phase 0. And players will simply reveal new activity cards. Now, as you notice, I've already set up the activity cards onto the board. As you notice, each of the activities has 1 through 3 labeled on them. At the start of each of the phases, a new one simply comes up. Very simple to understand. And no matter how many players are participating or how many rounds take place in the game, new activity cards are only introduced in the first 3 rounds of the game. So if you're playing a 4-player game which lasts 6 rounds, you're only going to see new activity cards in the first 3 rounds. Now, there are numerous activity cards that ship with the game, so each game will vary quite drastically depending upon which are randomly chosen or inserted at the startup of the game. After these activity cards are revealed, Phase 1 actually happens in the game, and each player is going to generate a flat income of 10 deniers. Deniers are represented by these coins that you see here. They come in denominations of 1, 5s, and 10s. Each player is going to get that flat rate of 10, but they're also going to have to pay salaries for each citizen that they have placed in particular buildings. Now, for instance, each citizen in the palace, and you see a little player aid right here, each citizen in the palace is going to cost that player 2 deniers. So the blue player is going to have to place 6 deniers since that would be his upkeep for those players in the palace. Each player in the bishopric is going to cost that player 1 denier. And there's no cost for players placing into the city hall. Very easy to understand, very easy to do. In Phase 2 of the game, players are going to assemble their workforce. Now, and each player is going to roll dice based upon where they place their citizens. And now, I've already done this to show everybody how it works. But again, it's very simple. Let's take the blue player, for instance. He has 3 players in the palace, 1 player in the bishopric, and 2 in the city hall. So he's going to roll 3 red dice, which I placed in his blue area of the central hub, 1 white dice, which he rolled and placed there, and 2 yellow dice, which he rolled and placed there. Each player is going to roll however many they have in each of these areas, and then a neutral character, which is represented by 1 of the grays, and the gray characters in here are going to have their own set of dice. Again, very easy to understand. What this basically means is that at the beginning of each round of play, there will always be 18 dice that you see there in the central area of the board available for use or purchased by players. These dice will be used mostly during the action phase of the game, but there will always be 18 dice available for all players. In Phase 3, 2 new events will come into play. Always 1 red event plus 1 other event of another color, and it's always dictated by whatever the red event card says. Cards are placed along this track on the bottom and can even go off the table. They're placed in the order drawn, and they will stay in play until they are combated by all the characters. So for instance, the first red card is drawn, and it shows that that 1 card from the white stack needs to be drawn. So that goes there, and then 1 card from the white stack. Again, very simple thing to understand, very quick to do. The Phase 4 is called the action phase, and is where the bulk of Troyes activities occur, and where its most important and very interesting decisions are found and will be made by all the players. What happens in each of these rounds is that each player in turn will select a single action to perform using a group of like-colored dice. Now, light-colored dice means they're going to pick either 1 through 3 all yellow dice, 1 through 3 all white dice, or 1 through 3 all red dice. Now, players can choose to use their own rolled dice or dice that other players have rolled, with the catch being that if you use other players' dice, you're going to have to purchase them from them. Now, purchasing them requires denier, or the money, that is dependent upon the dice group that a player chooses to use. For instance, if a player chooses just to use one die, it just costs 2 deniers. If they choose to use 2 dice, it costs 4 deniers each. And if they use to use a set of 3 dice, it costs 6 deniers each. Let me show you a real brief example to explain. Say the blue player chooses just to use 1 red die from his lot. It's not going to cost him anything because he controls that red die. However, if he chooses to use 1 white die and 1 white die from the gray player, that is using 2 dice total, so he's going to owe this player 4 deniers. If he wants to use 3 white dice, say his own, this one, and this one, that's using 3 total dice for 6 deniers each. So he's going to owe the gray player 6, or the bank, and 6 to the orange player. Very simple concept, but it allows the players to actually buy dice that they don't have available to them. The only drawback is that they have to pay that to that particular player. Now, this phase of the game almost feels like a worker placement game with a few added twists mixed in. In fact, the dice almost act as individual workers for each of the players, allowing them to take actions throughout the board until eventually all the combinations of dice run out, or simply all the dice run out in general. Now, what really makes this part of the game interesting is the level of interaction in all of this phase, in this entire action phase of the game. From deciding whose dice to use, where to use them, how many dice to use, it's just incredibly tense and creates some really nice moments in the game. And rolling a good set of dice on your side isn't always the answer either, as it's really mitigated by other players' ability to buy your dice from you. It's incredibly multi-layered, and it's wonderfully balanced throughout the entire portion of this part of the game. Now, what I didn't mention is that there's also an influence track, which is not a victory point track at the top of the game. Through the course of the game, you'll be gaining influence and losing influence, but what it's typically used for is 3 different actions. Buying additional citizens that you'll be able to place on each of the buildings, but it's also really used to mitigate dice rolls. It allows you to either re-roll 1 dice or flip dice from one side to another. It's a really good source to kind of take away the luck of rolling particular dice in the game. Now, some players are going to be really apprehensive about the majority of the game's major mechanical structure utilizing or revolving around dice, but I can say that quite to the contrary to belief of most people, that the dice are really not a major source of luck in the game. Bad rolls are really mitigated by your ability to purchase other players and by the use of influence throughout the course of the game. The only true randomness comes in the events that you see at the bottom, but those are even mitigated by the fact that all players are affected by these events at the same time, and you can't really plan for them at all. They're just chance luck that come up, and I do like that portion of the game quite a bit. Terra is a very complex game, but not so much that it's unapproachable by people. Its beauty really lies in its mechanics and its ability to consistently and overwhelmingly reward its players with quality choices and decisions from one round to the next. If I had only one complaint, it would probably be that the game is a little bit too short for my taste. I would like to have a longer game where you can develop more of your characteristics throughout the course of the game. Good thing about the game is that there's almost no downtime. Almost all the phases happen for each of the players at the same time. In my opinion, this and Seven Wonders are the 2 absolute gems that I have experienced thus far from the SN 2000 releases that I've played. Its dice mechanic is incredibly clever, it's fun to play, and the implementation of all of its pieces work in perfect harmony for me. That is Terra, and thank you for watching.